My name is Ava Lawson. I am 32 years old, and until the night everything broke apart, I worked the overnight shift as an operations supervisor at a medical distribution warehouse outside Indianapolis. I have never been the kind of woman who calls home for help. I was the one who stayed late, covered extra shifts, paid my own bills, and figured things out before anybody could tell me I was asking for too much. But that night, lying in the ICU with my arm wrapped so tightly I could barely feel my fingers, and every breath sending pain through my ribs, I made the call anyway. I truly believed that no matter how distant my family had always felt, this would be the one moment they would show up for me. Instead, I heard irritation in the background, music, laughter, glasses clinking, and then a cold voice telling me they were busy with my sister's party and could not leave over one more problem of mine. That was the moment something in me went quiet. Not broken, exactly, just cold. Like I had finally heard the truth they had been trying not to say out loud for years. To them, I was never the daughter worth rushing to. I was the burden who always survived somehow, the one expected to handle pain privately and return when everyone else was done celebrating. I stared at the dark hospital ceiling, listening to the monitors beep, trying not to cry, trying not to think about the fact that my family had chosen balloons and champagne over me in intensive care. What I did not know was that the worst part of that night was not being abandoned. It was what happened after the room went still, after two officers walked in, after one sentence turned my whole life into something I no longer recognized. Before I tell you who stepped into that ICU room next and why my phone blew up 1 year later, tell me what time it is where you are right now and where you're listening from, because I honestly want to know how far this story is about to travel. My parents were Mark and Patricia Lawson, and if you had seen us from the outside, you probably would have thought we were one of those ordinary Midwestern families who looked better in photos than they ever felt in real life. We lived in a suburb outside Indianapolis where every driveway had two cars, every lawn was cut on schedule, and every family pretended nothing ugly ever happened behind closed doors. My younger sister Brooke was the kind of girl people noticed the second she walked into a room. She had bright blonde hair, perfect teeth, effortless confidence, and a way of laughing that made people want to include her in everything. My mother adored her. My father admired her. Relatives called her sunshine. I was the one they described as reliable, which sounds like a compliment until you realize it usually means useful, quiet, and easy to ignore. Brooke always got the exciting things. She got the sweet 16 party with the photo booth and custom cake. She got a newer car before college. She got help with rent when she moved downtown. She got the engagement party with the champagne wall, floral arch, and catered dinner that apparently mattered more than the fact that I was in intensive care. Me, I got lectures about responsibility. I got secondhand furniture. I got reminded that I was older, tougher, and capable of handling things on my own. The strange part was that I still spent years trying to earn love from people who had already decided how much of it I deserved. I helped with bills when my father complained about mortgage payments. I brought groceries by when my mother said prices were getting out of control. When Brooke needed someone to pick her up after a breakup, I was the one who drove across town at midnight and sat with her in silence while she cried into my sweatshirt. I did all of it because part of me kept believing effort could close the distance between us. But that distance had always been there. It was in the way my mother's smile tightened whenever I spoke too long at dinner. It was in the way my father praised Brooke for ambition and called me intense for having the same kind of drive. It was in every holiday where Brooke sat in the center of the couch, opening gifts, while I stood in the kitchen refilling drinks and clearing plates before anyone even asked. I used to think maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe every family had one child who fit naturally and another who always felt like she had shown up to the wrong house by mistake. but lying in that ICU bed. After hearing music and laughter on the other end of the line while I tried to explain that I was hurt and scared and alone, all those years suddenly lined up in my mind like proof. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. They had not failed me once. They had been choosing her over me for as long as I could remember. And that night, they were not even pretending otherwise. The next morning, nobody came. Not my father with his truck keys in hand. Not my mother with fake concern arranged carefully across her face. Not Brooke. Not even with a rushed visit between makeup appointments and party photos. The only people who checked on me were nurses, a tired resident, and a woman from billing who spoke in that soft, professional tone hospitals use when they are about to tell you something terrifying. I nodded through everything like I was stronger than I felt, but the truth was I was barely holding myself together. My left side ached every time I shifted in bed. My arm was immobilized. My ribs felt like broken glass under my skin. The machine beside me kept beeping steadily as if my body were calm and not in complete revolt. Around noon, I made the mistake of opening Instagram. Brooke had posted a carousel from the party. There she was in a white satin dress, one hand over her mouth pretending to be surprised, even though she clearly knew the photographer was there. My mother stood beside her crying the kind of polished tears women cry when they know everyone is watching. My father had one arm around Brooke and the other lifted in a toast. There were roses everywhere, gold candles, linen tablecloths, a giant glowing sign with her new last name in cursive. Under the photos, she had written, "Best night ever." So grateful for the people who always show up for me. I stared at that caption until my vision blurred. It should not have hurt as much as it did, but there is something especially brutal about realizing the people who ignored your pain are still capable of warmth. Just not for you. I threw my phone onto the blanket and turned my head toward the window, but the memories came anyway. My high school graduation when my parents left early because Brooke had a dance recital rehearsal. Thanksgiving when my mother told me to change shirts because Brooke's boyfriend's family was coming, and I looked too tired for photos. Christmas morning when Brooke got jewelry and weekend trips, and I got a planner because my father said I liked practical things. Every memory carried the same message. Brooke was the celebration. I was the inconvenience between celebrations. By late afternoon, I had stopped checking my phone. That was when the silence in the room changed. You know how sometimes a space feels different before anything even happens? The air gets heavier. The noise from the hallway fades. You sense something coming before you can name it. I looked up when the door opened and saw two people I had never met before. One was a woman in a dark blazer with a badge clipped near her waist. The other was a man carrying a folder thick enough to make my stomach drop. They were not smiling. They were not hospital staff. And the first thing the woman said to me was, "Ava Lawson, we need to ask you a few questions about your identity." At first, I thought it was a mistake with insurance, or maybe some paperwork issue caused by the accident. I actually almost laughed. Identity was the last thing on my mind. I told them yes, that was me, and asked if something was wrong. The man opened the folder. The woman looked at me in a way I still remember because it was not pity exactly, but it was close. She said, "We believe your legal identity may not match your biological records." Then she placed an old photograph on my tray table, and the world tilted so hard I honestly thought I might pass out again. The child in the photograph could not have been older than 2. Dark curls, serious eyes, a tiny white sweater with one sleeve slipping off her shoulder. There was something so familiar about her face that it made my chest tighten before my mind could catch up. I kept staring because the longer I looked, the less it felt like I was looking at a stranger. The woman introduced herself as Detective Lena Morales. The man beside her was Special Agent Owen Price. They explained that after the accident, There had been a routine issue verifying part of my documentation through an expanded hospital identification process connected to an unresolved multi-state cold case review. That led to a secondary check. The secondary check led to a DNA flag. Then a court-authorized confirmation test was rushed because the match percentage was too strong to ignore. I did not understand half of what they were saying at first because my brain got stuck on one line printed beneath the photo: Eleanor Grace Whitaker, missing since August 1996, taken from Santa Barbara County, California. I remember looking up at them and saying, "That is not me." It came out automatically. Not because I believed it, but because the alternative was too big to take in all at once. Detective Morales did not argue. She simply opened the folder wider and showed me 3 more documents. One was the DNA report. Another was a missing child bulletin from decades ago. The third was a recent court document authorizing renewed investigative action based on the match. Special Agent Price told me that the odds were overwhelming. My biological parents had submitted DNA samples years ago and kept them on file with law enforcement. They had never stopped searching. For 30 years, they had never stopped. I kept waiting for someone to say this was a clerical error, but nobody did. Instead, they asked if I would consent to one more rapid comparison test just to eliminate any possible challenge later. I signed without fully feeling my hand. My heart was racing so hard the monitor started sounding faster. The nurse came in, glanced at the agents, adjusted a line, and left again, like she knew not to interrupt whatever disaster was unfolding in that room. Then Detective Morales said the sentence that made every childhood memory I had ever buried rise straight to the surface. "We believe the people who raised you were involved in your disappearance, not just aware of it. Involved." I could not speak. My mouth went dry. My mind flashed through every strange thing I had normalized growing up. The missing baby pictures before a certain age. The way my mother hated questions about my birth. The way my father once snapped at me for requesting a copy of my birth certificate for a college form and told me to stop digging through papers that did not concern me. The way I had never looked enough like anyone in the family for strangers to stop making awkward comments about it. Detective Morales said Mark Lawson had once worked as a contracted maintenance employee for a private estate in coastal California. Patricia had also worked there part-time in household support during the same period. The estate belonged to the Whitaker family, the family whose daughter disappeared. My mind could not hold all of it. I started crying without warning. Not dramatic sobs, just tears running sideways into my hair while I stared at the ceiling because it felt safer than looking at anyone. For 32 years, I had believed I was the problem in a family that did not know how to love me. Now 2 strangers were telling me the deeper truth might be that I had never actually belonged to them in the first place. Before they left, Agent Price told me someone from the Whitaker family's legal team was flying in. Detective Morales asked if there was anyone I trusted they could call for me. I almost laughed at that too, because after what I had just learned, I was no longer sure trust had ever meant the same thing to me as it did to other people. The confirmation came the next morning. 99.999% probability. No meaningful margin for doubt. By then I had not slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother arranging flowers for Brooke's party, while somewhere in the same state I lay in intensive care with a false name and a real history I had never been told. Around noon, a man in an expensive Navy suit arrived first. His name was Daniel Mercer, counsel for the Whitaker family, and he had the kind of calm voice people use when they know the truth is devastating but no longer avoidable. He explained the timeline carefully. 30 years earlier, the Whitakers had received a ransom demand after their daughter disappeared from the family's coastal property. Multiple payments had been made through intermediaries. The child was never returned. The couple who vanished from contract work around the same time later surfaced in the Midwest under new paperwork. Over time, the trail went cold. Mercer did not dramatize any of it. He did not need to. Every word felt like glass. Then he told me Richard Whitaker was on his way to the hospital and wanted to meet me only if I was comfortable. That if I needed more time, he would wait. I had spent my whole life around people who demanded emotional labor from me. It shocked me that a stranger would offer restraint instead. When Richard finally walked into the room, I understood immediately why people used words like powerful around men like him, but power was not what hit me first. Grief did. He was tall, silver at the temples, wearing a dark overcoat that looked tailored even though it was raining outside. He stopped near the foot of my bed and just looked at me like he was trying to memorize every feature before his courage gave out. His eyes filled before he even spoke. He said my first name the way people say a prayer they are afraid to hope has been answered. Not Ava. Eleanor. I did not correct him. I could not. Something about the sound of it made my throat close. He came closer slowly, like approaching a frightened animal, and told me he was not here to overwhelm me. He said he only needed me to know two things. First, none of this was my fault. Second, I had been loved every single day of my life, even when I had no way of knowing it. That nearly destroyed me. Because there is a specific kind of pain in realizing the love you begged for in one house had existed all along in another. Only an entire crime had stood between you and it. Richard told me my biological mother, Elena, was still in California because her doctors had advised against immediate travel. He told me I had an older sister named Claire who had grown up in the shadow of my disappearance and never let a birthday pass without mentioning me. He told me there had always been a room kept for me, not turned into storage, not repurposed, kept. I cried harder at that than I did at the DNA results, because a room kept for you means someone expected your return, even when time tried to make it irrational. He did not ask me to call him Dad. He did not ask for forgiveness on behalf of a life he had missed. He only sat down beside the bed and told me he had already taken care of the hospital expenses, the rehabilitation plan, and any legal representation I might need. Not to buy me, not to impress me, just so I would never again have to lie awake wondering whether pain was going to bankrupt me. For the first time since the accident, I felt something other than shock. I felt safe. Later that evening, Detective Morales returned with more information. Mark and Patricia had not only been located. They had been under quiet observation while investigators finalized the arrest package. Financial records connected them to historical extortion transfers. There were inconsistencies in my early documents that supported long-term identity fraud. The case was no longer theoretical. It was moving. Richard asked me gently if I wanted to confront them once I was strong enough. He made it clear the choice was mine. I looked down at my bandaged arm, at the bruises blooming along my skin, and I realized something cold and steady had replaced the helplessness I felt the night before. Yes, I said. I want to hear them say it to my face, not because I needed closure, because I needed the truth stripped of every excuse they had hidden behind for 30 years. A week later, I was discharged into private outpatient care arranged by Richard's team, and 2 days after that, I asked to go to the house where I had grown up. Not because I wanted to go home. That word no longer belonged there. I wanted to stand in that living room and see whether the people who had dismissed me so casually from an ICU bed could still look me in the eye once the lie was over. Richard came with me. So did Detective Morales and Agent Price, though they waited until the signal to come in. When Patricia opened the door, she looked annoyed before she looked shocked. That lasted less than a second. Then she saw the people behind me and all the color drained from her face. Mark stepped out from the hallway with that same hard expression he had worn my whole life, but I saw fear crack through it almost instantly. Brooke was in the kitchen, still surrounded by leftover decorations and half-boxed gifts from the engagement party. The symbolism would have been funny if it were not so sick. Nobody spoke at first. I walked into the room slowly, taking in the couch where Brooke had opened Christmas presents, the dining table where I had spent years clearing plates while everyone else laughed, the framed family photos on the wall that suddenly looked less like memories and more like evidence. Patricia started crying before I even said anything. She called me Ava in that wounded tone mothers use when they want credit for suffering caused by their own choices. I told her not to call me that until she answered one question. Did you take me? She sat down so fast she nearly missed the chair. Mark said we should all calm down, which was rich coming from a man whose entire life had been built on keeping me confused and obedient. Richard did not raise his voice. He simply placed a folder on the table and said federal charges were ready. This was their chance to speak before handcuffs did the rest. What followed did not feel like a confession. It felt like rot finally surfacing. Mark admitted that he and Patricia had known the Whitaker estate well enough to exploit its routines. He said they had needed money and believed one big ransom would solve everything. But once it worked, once they had me, turning back became impossible. Patricia claimed she had wanted to leave me somewhere safe after the first payment. Mark said that was a lie. They argued over details like a divorced couple fighting about kitchen paint while discussing the theft of a child. Brooke kept saying, "Stop, stop, stop," like repetition could reverse reality. Then Patricia said the ugliest thing she could have said, maybe because truth makes selfish people crueler when they can no longer hide. She said I had made her feel trapped every day of her life, that every time she looked at me she remembered what they had done, and it was easier to resent me than live with her own guilt. I should tell you that I broke down in that moment or screamed or begged for some explanation that would make any of it human. I did not. I went completely still. Because that sentence explained everything. Why I was treated like an obligation. Why Brooke got softness and I got scrutiny. Why my pain had never moved them. I was not the daughter they failed to love properly. I was the evidence they hated having to feed. Brooke started crying then. Real crying. Mascara running. Hands shaking. She looked at my parents, then at me, then back at the photos on the wall like she was seeing the house for the first time too. But even in that moment, my sympathy did not go very far. She had built her life on my erasure and never once questioned why I was always the one told to wait, adjust, understand, absorb. Mark tried one last move. He said none of that changed the fact that they had raised me, that they had clothed me, fed me, given me a life. I looked at him and said, "No, you gave me a lie and expected gratitude because it was easier than prison." That was the signal. Detective Morales and Agent Price entered with the rest of the team behind them. Patricia started begging immediately. Mark cursed once, then went pale when he heard the full list of charges: kidnapping, extortion, identity fraud, conspiracy, obstruction. There were also civil actions coming. Daniel Mercer had made that very clear. The Whitakers were not just reclaiming me, they were going to dismantle every stolen piece of the life built from my disappearance. Brooke's fiancé called while agents were still in the house. I know because her phone kept lighting up on the counter with his name, and then finally a text preview that read, "We are done." I did not pick it up. I did not need to. The room already sounded like consequences. Patricia was sobbing that she could explain everything to the community, as if there were a public relations version of child abduction that might save her country club friends from judging her too harshly. Mark was led outside in handcuffs past the neighbors who had started gathering at the curb. Cameras would come later. So would the headlines. So would the asset freezes, the mortgage review, the legal filings, the humiliation Brooke would endure when every wedding guest learned exactly what kind of family she came from. That afternoon, the entire structure of their lives collapsed in front of me, and the shocking part was not how dramatic it looked. The shocking part was how little triumph I felt. Not because they did not deserve it. They did. but because revenge, real revenge, is quieter than people think. It is not always rage. Sometimes it is simply standing there untouched, while the people who taught you to feel small finally realize they have no power over you at all. The first months in California felt unreal in ways both beautiful and painful. Richard brought me to the house where I had once lived as a toddler, though it was Elena who made it feel like something more than a monument to grief. She met me at the front door and touched my face like she had been holding that gesture in her body for 30 years. Claire cried the first time she hugged me, and then laughed through tears because she said she had spent half her childhood inventing versions of the sister she hoped would come back someday, and none of those versions had ever been as stubborn as I was. There was a room upstairs that had been kept all those years. The furniture had changed over time, but the intention never had. I stood in that doorway for a long time before going in. It did not magically fix anything. Healing is not that simple, but it gave me something I had never had before, which was proof that my absence had mattered. I spent months in physical therapy and even longer in emotional recovery. I chose not to move into the family estate permanently. I rented a small place in Santa Barbara instead, close enough to visit often, far enough to build a self that was not entirely defined by trauma or wealth. Richard offered me any role I wanted inside the company. I said no. Elena worried that I was trying too hard to prove I could survive without help. She was partly right. Still, I needed something that belonged to me. So I began working with a nonprofit partnership funded by the Whitaker Foundation that supported missing children, identity restoration cases, and families navigating long-term trauma. It was the first work I had ever done that made my pain feel useful without asking me to glorify it. The legal cases against Mark and Patricia dragged on exactly the way ugly truth usually does, but the public fallout hit fast. Their assets were reviewed. Their home was tied up in litigation. Their old social circle vanished. Brooke's engagement ended. Her freelance event work dried up after local coverage connected her family name to the case. People who once praised my mother for her taste and my father for his discipline suddenly remembered other appointments, other calls, other places to be. Funny how fast loyalty disappears when evil stops dressing itself up as respectability. 1 year after the accident, I was sitting at my kitchen table going through grant proposals when my phone started vibrating nonstop. I ignored the first few calls because unknown numbers no longer interested me. Then I noticed the area code, Indiana. By the time I picked up the phone, there were 29 missed calls in 1 hour. Some were from Patricia. Some were from Brooke. One voicemail from Patricia was just crying and breathless fragments about how everything had gone too far and how they needed to talk. Brooke's messages were worse because they still carried that same buried entitlement I had grown up around. She said I needed to stop being cruel. She said our family had already suffered enough. She said maybe if I made one statement to the attorneys or the press about wanting peace, some of the financial pressure could ease. There it was. Even after everything, they still did not want me.